So our next presentation is actually going to be with Stacy Leeds. It's going to cover the legal framework of co-ops in Indian country. Stacy Leeds is the foundation professor of law and leadership at the Sandra Day O'Connor College at the Arizona State University. Someone I have been very fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with and work for, my fellow Cherokee. So Stacy, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Osio Nagad, Stacy Leeds Dawado, Jichalagi. My name is Stacy Leeds, and as Whitney mentioned, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I now teach at the Indian Legal Program at the University, Arizona State University Law School. And I also work with several tribes as a tribal court judge and also with their business entities. And so I just want to start off for all the sponsors that helped made this possible, and to Whitney and others who are providing support for us here on this call. I appreciate you inviting me to share some time at this wonderful event and to talk about the legal framework and the mechanics of how ag cooperatives can work inside of Indian country. And I also feel like it's a bit of a full circle moment, both in the short term and in the long term sense. In the short term, just 9 years ago, I was a brand new dean at the University of Arkansas School of Law, and I was trying to figure out how to maximize and expand the school's very strong ag law program and reputation, which produced so many of our ag law experts and policymakers inside USDA today, people like Doug O'Brien and Janie Hipp. And Janie and I started putting our brains together to connect that Arkansas ag law expertise with the needs of Indian country, both because there was a glaring need that we had observed through our own contacts and ties to Indian country, but also in that the land grant institutions have a responsibility to do better by the tribes that gave them the land grant universities their origin, either by providing the land base itself or by providing financial startup funds when those various homelands or surplus lands, if you will, were sold off during that disgraceful Indian removal time period, and then converted to be the source of wealth to create public land grant institutions. And that connection is one that many of us in Indian country have known about for a long time, but it's a connection that was made more publicly known in the last 2 years, thanks to the Native journalists who work with High Country News. And so as you think of potential partners in all of this, don't be afraid to take advantage of what our universities have to offer, and be bold in what you ask for. And always think of all the land grant institutions, the public stake institutions, but also historically Black colleges and universities, and now tribal colleges. There's a lot of partnerships to be made there, and there's a wealth of information. A lot of them want to work with tribal communities and maybe just don't have the contacts and don't know how. But then others just haven't been educated of their tie to tribal communities. And so I think that there's some of us who can help connect those dots, but I want you to always put that in your pocket as a resource. Back at that time, 9 years ago, I was able to raise the money and get Janie to leave DC during the Obama administration and come back home to Arkansas so that we could create and launch the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative at the University of Arkansas, which continues to do so much important work thanks to the leadership after Janie, which was Colby Duran, and also current director Aaron Parker and associate director Carly Hotvet. They're doing such impressive work. When we envisioned that work, we talked to a lot of folks in Indian country and a lot of producers to try to get a sense of what was needed on the ground to support Indigenous producers. And when we would start bringing up the conversation about cooperatives, we would frequently hear, not so much from the Native producers, but from other people in this space, tribes and Native Americans really don't do that. Or worst, and maybe more ill-informed, we would sometimes hear tribes and Native producers on reservation can't do that. And then yet there was this other camp of people that were perhaps more open-minded about the idea, and they would ask, can you do that under tribal law? And that of answer is, of course, yes, yes, and yes. And so, part of that, lack of visibility, to be fair, is that most of the literature that's out there nationally that talks about ag cooperatives makes no mention of Indian country, individual producers inside of Indian country, or the tribes. And even the literature that targets Indian country and talks about the choices that are available to tribes and individuals when you are considering what business entity to form, most of those also don't mention cooperatives at all. And that changes today, right, with programs like this and the change that's underway with the bold new vision of the Native American Ag Fund and the other national entities that are putting this issue more on the front burner with this concept of the regional hubs and sub-hubs discussion. So like us, many of you are aware of small co-ops that have existed throughout Indian country, right? And granted, most of those are on smaller scale than what we're talking about today. And some of these co-ops, of course, have been in existence in Indian country for many decades. But they, like much of the indigenous farmers who had farmed for centuries in countless generations inside of Indian country, have remained largely invisible to the general public. And when I say general public, I also mean many of the offices within federal agencies that could be very helpful to them. And I think that we're in a pretty magic moment here, and the timing is right to really blast these forward. Nothing is off the table right now in terms of the consideration and the support that is available. And I think that that's true inside both the Department of Interior and USDA at this time. The history books will tell you that the first cooperatives as a legal entity were created in Europe in the 17th century when farmers pooled their resources together to more efficiently grow their food. Now, we in Indian country know better than that, right? All the roads that led to Chaco Canyon were not made by individual indigenous farmers that were acting on their own. And the large tribe confederacies that existed in the Southeast were not just solely put together as military alliances. They were economic engines that brought locally organized communities together for trade and international trade at that. And every indigenous region that we all come from has similar stories built around elaborate food systems for both personal consumption use and community survival, but also as trade as a key component of those indigenous economies. So in the longer term, full circle context, cooperatives also, I think, hold a lot of promise to offer as a legal mechanism that can mitigate, if not reverse, some of the harmful impacts of the forced allotment process, which we all know now to be a failed federal policy that not only disrupted Indian land tenure systems and created a situation where the work of indigenous farmers is harder post-allotment than it was pre-allotment generations. But I also think that there's a lot to be said about how that post-allotment reality all but guaranteed that the revenue from Indian country producers would not be retained in Indian country. Now, the allotment process, as most of you on this call know, very unapologetically broke up land holdings, but it also broke up agricultural cooperatives with this false narrative that it would be a way for the federal government to teach Indians how to be better farmers and better users of land and natural resources. Now we see a situation where one of the important tools that we might use to scale up our agricultural systems can be a return to our cooperative model, right? That model that helped us feed ourselves and engaged in trade with markets bigger than ourselves and bigger than our own communities. And as the outside world now goes to look for indigenous farmers in the Southwest to learn how to grow with more efficient use of water, we can also revert to those cooperative models in addition to our traditional knowledge that has always worked well for us. just with refreshed tool sets, I think, and a little bit more formalized legal structure and markets that we now find ourselves in. So I thought that I would talk about first, how do you get started in this and what kind of things that you might want to consider. From a legal standpoint, a cooperative is slightly different from forming any other business entities. And so you may have people who come together, like Indigenous producers, to strategize about how they want to address their shared goals and how they want to solve some problems that they see, and then determine whether you want to organize to get things to market or get things more efficiently sold, so that your value system is incorporated as part of that solution. And whether that means that this entity does training and technical assistance for itself to bring that next generation of producers along, or whether you conclude for your own purposes that it really is simply a matter of reducing the time and cost to market for our Indigenous producers so that they can be more financially successful. Now, this initial group of people who come together to form this entity would be the charter members of the co-op, and they could choose into whether they wanted to enter into a general partnership or a corporation or an LLC for legal purposes. But cooperatives add some more benefits and protections that you might want to consider when you're making these choices. And this is where the first legal nuance for Indian country comes into play. When you look at the agricultural laws and codes of most states, they will have cooperatives as one of the business entities that you might use to create by entering into this filing or registration with the state. And you usually would pay a small fee, such as $100 or so, to the state, file your articles of incorporation. That's a pretty straightforward process. After you have that formal entity and the paperwork that gets filed, you would then start developing your membership through your membership agreement. It spells out the duties and responsibilities that all the members of that co-op would have for themselves, along with your bylaws that govern that entity and spell out what kind of major decisions would require actual member votes versus the kinds of powers that would be retained or delegated by a board of directors that would be seated. And what you'll want to have in your documents is, of course, a really clear distinction between the business activity itself and the business collective owners or members, and make sure that you maintain those distinctions. But I want to strongly encourage tribes to add a provision in their codes for an Agricultural Cooperative Associations Act, or just make a small section within your tribe's pre-existing business entities code to provide this option to our producers. And the same thing with the creation of nonprofits pursuant to tribal law. And as I always scan through tribal codes, it's still very few that I see that have a business entity option for cooperatives and nonprofits. The LLC or the corporate entity options seem to be the most common approach. And still then, a lot of these tribal codes often are written with just the tribe's business entities as the universe, right? And that the options that are available are made as to how the tribal owned businesses may proceed. And they're not usually thought of in terms of tools that will be necessary to grow true private sectors on our reservations, and to do it in a way that is culturally relevant and specific to that tribe for its own Indian country. And so this question about, is that something tribes can do? Absolutely. And it's an exercise of inherent tribal sovereignty to do so. And the ability to set up one of these business entities codes so that your people have the ability to charter their entity under tribal law is one of the retained sovereign powers that the United States still recognizes. And it's a service to your people, to your producers, and it need not only be available just to tribal citizens or members that can take advantage of this. If tribes provide no option at all, their people will come together without legal protections available to them, and people will come together without thinking through all of the tax ramifications. Or they will simply do what's easy, and they will go to the state for their process and mechanisms. And one of the foundations of federal Indian law is that there's a general presumption against states having any power inside of Indian country. And that means that unless Congress has expressly invited the state in, recognize state legislative or regulatory powers that are in effect usually don't extend to Indians inside their tribe's Indian country. And so the state actually lacks the authority to be there. And if you go to the state to have your cooperative filed as a state entity, you have invited the state in where they otherwise have no authority over you. And you have created an uncertainty. And that's the last thing you want as you're starting a new business relationship. This uncertainty may include whether there are now state income tax ramifications for members or the entity itself, whether this new cooperative entity may be subject now to the jurisdiction of the state courts. And it may mean that you have just invited in state regulatory laws, whether that be land use or environmental regulations or other rules that can now govern this new entity by extension, also maybe governing members of the cooperative. And that's why I prefer and frankly preach that tribally chartered agricultural cooperatives is the way to go, both for tribally owned businesses, but also cooperatives that are made up solely of individual members. So for the producers on this call, go home and talk to your council members. To the tribal employees on this call, advocate from your programmatic position of power. And to the federal employees that are on this call, don't presume that state filing is the default, and expressly ask about, research, and encourage tribal business entity laws to support the goals of Indigenous producers. The downside for the tribes in doing this is very small. Revision of your code and maybe some administrative oversight that you're not taking up right now. But the upside to the local economy and to your producers far exceeds any new responsibility that the tribal government would need to take on with this. And when you consider who the members of the cooperative will be, think more broadly than we all may be conditioned to do. Yes, of course, you want your Native American producers on your reservation to be members, but also think about the non-Indian farmers in and around your tribe's Indian country too. And think about Indigenous ag producers in your region. They all have a stake in the success of this cooperative, and it ensures that more dollars stay in your communities. A theme that you're hearing over and over today and throughout the next few days, I'm sure. And think beyond individuals when you think about who could be a member of these cooperatives. One of the advantages to cooperatives is that members need not be individuals only. It could be another LLC or some other type of business sub-entity, so long as the way that you set up your structure has that possibility in your documents. And so let's say that in the past, you have gone as an ag producer and you have approached your tribe or your tribe's wholly owned LLC that is charged with doing non-gaming diversification of the tribal economy. And they've declined to engage because they said that it didn't fit the model of the types of projects they were pursuing. And likely because they do not have the expertise in ag. They don't want to just be an investor in a traditional sense in the farming enterprise. It might not just fit their model. But that tribal LLC could be a member of your cooperative that could engage and be a part of the cooperative with very little risk. And you could take advantage of the LLC's expertise in other areas that support the work of your producers. So let me give you an example in this. I'm one of the founding board members of Katua LLC. It's the Economic Development Board charged with diversifying the Eastern Band Cherokee economy. And we make most of our decisions based on making money for the tribe. So we go and we do investments in off-reservation projects just to keep our cash flow going, things that we know are a pretty slam dunk way to make money and bring it back to the tribe. But we also look at the needs of the tribe and we make decisions that are not purely profit driven, the way a corporation would that might be required to maximize their profits for a group of shareholders. So one of the projects we invested in was acquiring in a bankruptcy a housing manufacturing company. And we know that there is a housing crunch on the reservation, like there is on so many. And we know that it not only would impact tribal citizens that might want to live there and that they could take advantage of our products, but it also makes it, the housing crunch is also really hard on other tribal businesses, including the gaming enterprise, because there's almost no workforce housing on the reservation and people have to drive over an hour just to come to work. So we made a decision that we know will still turn some profit, but we also have other very clear community wins in this. We're providing a service that otherwise isn't available and will also make money on it. So that same type of LLC exists all over Indian country. And they might have an interest that you can maximize their business talents in marketing, supply chain management, and other areas. If you look across Indian country in accounting, in IT, in all sorts of marketing of other types of business, our bench is actually very deep. We have so many professionals that we can tap into. And so, that might be just something to take into consideration. They may be interested if the ag expertise is actually there and it's a cooperative structure, as opposed to them taking the whole thing on themselves. So when I get asked the biggest difference in a startup company and a new corporation in the mainstream market and a new tribal business like Katua LLC, that was a startup 2 years ago. It's crystal clear to me, and it speaks to what Tony had said in her introductory remarks. For mainstream startups, their goal is to create something new and have an exit, a big exit, right? Get somebody to come in and buy it or infuse a lot of equity into it and then get out of it and move on to the next thing. With tribes, we're not going anywhere, right? We have been here for thousands of years and we will be here for thousands more. Our businesses absolutely need to make money, but they do so with a community-based rate of return. Capture those dollars, keep that value in the communities, and that's where you get your real win-win. So as I start to get to the end, I'm going to talk about the tax implications and also some concerns about raising capital. Cooperatives are eligible to receive some special treatment for federal tax purposes. An agricultural co-op is generally formed under state law, but we're going to talk about also making sure that that tribal option is available. And it's usually a special type of corporation. So federal and local laws, be they state or tribal, will determine how that co-op gets taxed or not, right? How it doesn't get taxed. And this is why I think it's so important for tribes to enter this space. A regular corporation in the mainstream is generally subject to a corporate tax rate of 21% on its taxable profits. If those profits get distributed out to the shareholders as dividends, the corporation cannot deduct those dividends that they pay out, and the shareholders can also get taxed for their individual income. So that means that corporate profits actually are subject to double taxation. A qualifying cooperative, on the other hand, can claim deductions for its profits that are properly distributed out or allocated to its member patrons on the basis of their patronage with the co-op. So the co-op avoids the corporate income tax to the extent its profits are offset with these patronage deductions. And so the member patrons may get taxed as personal income for federal income tax purposes, but this would only be on one level of taxation rather than two levels, as I had just described with a regular corporation. And there may be some special rules that also can reduce the tax that the member patrons pay on their share of the corporate profits. And of course, like anything, these technical tax rules are going to apply to co-ops in a complicated fashion. And so you're going to go out, talk to your tax accountant or your attorneys that are familiar with all of these rules. However, there are thousands, right, of these co-ops operating throughout the United States, and a number of these organizations and associations that can provide some assistance for both forming the co-op itself and structuring those operations. We just need to fill in the gap with people who really understand Indian law and taxation. And that's some of the work that I think that we need to find meaningful support for. If ever there was a perfect model for an ag producer law and tax clinic, right, to be run by one of these nonprofits in this post-Keepseagle world, I think that this is it. So remember that cooperatives are not required to issue dividends to all members. It can define the classes of members that would receive the dividends. It could just be the producers. And it can also choose how some of that carryover gets managed in a couple of ways. So the co-op could keep it as working capital to use on projects that support the producers, or they could also pass the tax deductions on to individual members. And remember, when you set up this for yourselves, you define those classes. So you have control, particularly if you have the legal infrastructure at the tribal level that helps define these options with indigenous producers and what they need in mind. So finally, I want to talk about attracting capital. It's often noted that it can be a challenge to get investors for cooperatives, and that cooperatives may struggle to find financing. And this might be the reason that you want to consider the path of an LLC rather than a cooperative, particularly in that there's more capital sometimes that gets pushed out to Indian country through guaranteed loan programs, CDFIs, or socially relevant investing, right? But those can still be used by the individual producers, with the cooperative being an added bonus that helps them out. And so as you've heard today, there are many USDA programs for the development of rural cooperatives that include grants and other resources. And then there are also donors out there like NAF that can present options for more funding that's available than you might find with another model. And so I'll just end with this. Many state laws set up cooperatives to function as quasi nonprofits, meaning that you can accept donations from foundations or from individual private donors, and those donors are then putting that money out there similarly to what they would be with a nonprofit, and they can get tax breaks for those contributions. All right, so with that, I will give it back to Whitney for the Q&A section, but I appreciate you being here.
Great, thank you so much, Stacy. I do want to reference one potential resource because you had mentioned the codes. So I wanted to, I'll include a link here in the chat box, but the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas has a model tribal food code. And I believe, if I remember correctly, they have an agricultural business entities code section. So I will include a link to that in there. But just as a reminder, if you have any questions for Stacy, if you want to include them here in the chat. I do, maybe we have one comment here, if you could maybe speak to, because there was a question about, or more of a comment about investing, or about how investors not understanding to choose to invest in anything other than a state or nonprofit, for example. Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, and I think that that's because the clarity about the parity between state and tribal business entities just isn't out there for people to be educated about. And so just as you could go out and choose a state to incorporate in that has laws that are advantageous to your entity, tribes are able to do the same thing, particularly if you're talking about people who are within that tribe's jurisdiction. So their tribal citizens, wherever they live, are always going to be within the tribe's jurisdiction. But the people who live within that tribe's Indian country, whether they're tribal citizens or not, I think would have the ability to enter into this. This would be no different than a store coming to open up a Dollar General or something on your reservation. They would file with your business entity's office just like anybody else. And so having that option where a cooperative can do that too just seems like such a no-brainer for me. And so that's what I'm thinking of, that people who are going to do business on the reservation or tribal citizens themselves that want to start this, that would be available to them. You know, with a nonprofit, I linked that in with a cooperative. Just earlier this year, I was working with a group of tribal citizens that wanted to do a nonprofit outside the ag sector, but they were trying to figure out how to do that. And we looked at the codes of all of the tribes of the people who were that group of citizens. And not one of the tribes had amended their business code to make it to where you could set up a tribally chartered individual, nonprofit under tribal law. And it is just as easy as creating the LLC or the corporate opportunity. You just have to have the language in there to empower those individuals to make those choices. But when we don't have those laws on the books, we've made that choice for them, and that's unfortunate.
And I think you spoke to this next question a little bit already, but from perspective of a Native producer, how would they file with their tribal government to set up those businesses off reservation?
Yeah, so I think about it just like, someone decides to set up a corporation in Delaware, but they're doing business in 30 other states, right? So I think of the tribe as my Delaware, right? And I choose to set it up under tribal law, but I'm doing business in those other jurisdictions the same way any other LLC or corporation does business in those multiple jurisdictions. Now, it might be under the state law that you're working with off reservation. You still might need to file as a business entity to not get yourself into some sort of a situation, just in terms of a business licensing, but it doesn't mean that you have to elect to have your whole business entity be governed by state law when there's a tribal law option. So that's how I'm thinking through it.
That's helpful, thank you. So if you have any other questions, feel free to include those in the chat. Like I mentioned earlier, we will be able to follow up with you individually and answer any questions we may have missed. But Stacy, thank you so much for your presentation today and for sharing your expertise with us as well.